Tenor George Shirley performed Franz Schubert's famous song, On Music, on May 27, 1993, as part of a tribute to the then recently deceased contralto Marian Anderson. At the concert's conclusion, Mr. Shirley informed me in an impromptu interview that there was no essential difference between the spirit of a German art song or lied and this.
Little boy, how old are you? Little boy, how old are you? Little boy, how old are you? Sir, I'm only 12 years old. This little boy had to remember that he was born the 25th of December. Lawyers and doctors were amazed and had to give the little boy the praise. Little boy, how old are you? Little boy, how old are you? Little boy, how old are you? Sir, I'm only 12 years old. Lawyers and doctors stood and wondered as though they had been struck by thunder. Then they decided while they wondered that all mankind must come under. Little boy, how old are you? Little boy, how old are you? Little boy, how old are you? Sir, I'm only 12 years old. The last time the little boy was seen, he was standing on Mount Olivet Green. When he dispersed all the crowd, he entered up into a cloud. Little boy, how old are you? Little boy, how old are you? Little boy, how old are you? Sir, I'm only 12 years old.
Why was George Shirley right? Why is Roland Hayes' spiritual, Lil' Boy, and Franz Schubert's Hymn to Music brothers in the spirit? The classical principle and the poetic principle are identical. That principle is that there is an inherent beauty in truth itself. We hold these truths to be beautiful, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. For 50 plus years, Caleb Bingham's book, The Columbian Orator, first published in 1797 and then in 23 subsequent editions, was the central text consulted by American school children and aspiring public speakers in the pulpit, on the law bench, and within the Congress. Because, in the words of one historian, a Republican discourse had to find the right pitch. He meant the right tone, or what we might call the right voicing. A gentleman's language, but not an aristocrat's. Both the 21-year-old Abraham Lincoln and the 12-year-old Frederick Douglass were educated by passages from Cicero, Plato, Benjamin Franklin, and Lazare Carnot, as well as American, British, and French teachers, clergymen, and statesmen. Shakespeare is a second great influence on American life of that period. The Astor Place riot of May 1849, which left at least 22 people dead and 120 injured, was between two Shakespeare factions, the one supporting American actor Edwin Forrest, the other British aristocratic actor William Charles Macready. California gold prospectors entertained themselves at night by reciting whole passages of Shakespeare by heart. American Confederate and Union soldiers thrown into the fratricidal War of the Secession, 1861 to 65, if they were familiar with Shakespeare's Hamlet, could not have avoided hearing the echoes of the soliloquy of the murderous King Claudius, who killed his brother to ascend Denmark's throne, in the words of Lincoln's second inaugural address.
Oh, my offense is rank. It smells to heaven. It hath the primal eldest curse upon't, a brother's murder. Pray can I not, though inclination be as sharp as will, my stronger guilt defeats my strong intent, and like a man to double business bound, I stand in pause where I shall first begin and both neglect. What if this cursed hand were thicker than itself with brother's blood? Is there not rain enough in the sweet heavens to wash it white as snow? Whereto serves mercy but to confront the visage of offense? And what's in prayer but this twofold force, to be forestalled ere we come to fall, or pardoned being down? Then I look up, my fault is past. But oh, what form of prayer can serve my turn? Forgive me my foul murder. That cannot be, since I'm still possessed of those effects for which I did the murder. My crown, mine own ambition, and my queen.
One-eighth of the whole population were colored slaves, not distributed generally over the Union, but localized in the southern part of it. These slaves constituted a peculiar and powerful interest. All knew that this interest was somehow to cause the war, to strengthen, to perpetuate, and extend this interest was the object for which the insurgents would rend the Union even by war, while the government claimed no right to do more than to restrict the territorial enlargement of it. Neither party expected for the war the magnitude or the duration which it has already attained. Neither anticipated that the cause of the conflict might cease with or even before the conflict itself should cease. Each looked for an easier triumph and a result less fundamental and astounding. Both read the same Bible and prayed to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. It may seem strange that any man should dare to ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces. But let us judge not, that we be not judged of. The prayers of both could not be answered. That of neither has been answered fully. The Almighty has his own purposes. Woe unto the world because of offenses. For it must needs be that offenses come, but woe to that man by whom the offense cometh.
The terrible truth of Lincoln's words was nonetheless beautiful, especially in its concluding vision of a renewed union with malice toward none, with charity for all. It was called by Frederick Douglass, who was present for the speech and had differences with Lincoln at various times, a noble effort. Assassination, however, proved the primary means for removing America's poets and men of vision. 41 days after his second inaugural address, Lincoln was dead. President John Kennedy's inaugural and Apollo speeches, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's 1963 I Have a Dream and 1968 Mountaintop speeches are etched in the history and the forward motion of America. But King was also assassinated, as was Kennedy. King's inspiration for creative nonviolent direct action, India's liberator Mahatma Gandhi, was assassinated in 1947. King's apparent opposite, the eloquent and fearless Malcolm X, whose international focus on Africa had superseded the narrow focus of the civil rights movement, and who was uncompromisingly dignified and fierce in his rejection of the slave mentality that then affected mostly African Americans and today affects far more people in the country, was also assassinated. That murder, as well as the 1969 assassination in Chicago of Black Panther Party 21-year-old Fred Hampton, has received a new attention in the past 3 months. The threat of an alliance, a sort of coincidence of opposites between Dr. King and Minister Malcolm X, that would have organized all Americans through a particular effort around voting and elections, threatened to cause what Samuel P. Huntington and others called a crisis of democracy. But when Robert Kennedy stopped an outbreak of violence in Cleveland the night of Martin Luther King's murder, April 4th, 1968, by reciting a passage from the Greek poet Aeschylus, Robert Kennedy's favorite poet, he demonstrated what it actually takes to govern. Truth, recited as a poem, delivered to the people, until at last, in our despite, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God. He, King, Malcolm, and others actually threatened the renaissance of American classical culture through an intense public discourse, which, from the founding of the nation, had combined beauty with truth. How do we now educate a new generation to reject the information society in favor of the truthful society? That new generation must find beauty through music. Then they can find their way back to the truth. Economist Lyndon LaRouche gave an example of such an educational process, which he had witnessed in 1995.
One of the things which was most delicious was we stopped in Leipzig, and I had a very unusual experience in the sense of participating for several hours in auditing the rehearsal of the Thomanerchor in Leipzig. And then the next evening, at the evening Vesper service, hearing the performance of the complete repertoire for that week at the service and being able to compare what had been gone through with the rehearsal and what was heard in the evening. Now, let me just qualify for those who may not know it. Some of you here do know this. The Thomas Cathedral Choir is a separate school, has been in existence since the year AD 1212. It has, according to all reputation, an unbroken singing program that it would sing every week on Friday evening at Vesper service. And that's been going on since AD 1212. The nearest thing they had to a break was in the middle of the Black Death in the middle of the 14th century, at which point they were down to 3 boys because the Black Death was killing off the singers, but they still sang. So the word is that they've sung for almost 800 years. Now, the discipline is tremendous. The cantor who was conducting the performance is himself a product of the school, and was a very trained musician, about 40 years of age, but a full bearer of the tradition. Let me just identify the tradition, and then I'll come back to in due course how it bears on here. Every week, these boys, who range from 7 to about 18, that is, it's a secondary school program, they are chosen for their voice and their musicality. But they're given a full gymnasium education, like a secondary school, from that time until they complete graduation. Their musical work is done as a part of the total program of studies. Each week, from the beginning of the week until Friday, 4 days a week, normally, except this particular week, but they only had 3 days because of a holiday. 4 days or 3 days a week in this case. They start from scratch with a completely new repertoire for that week's Friday evening Vesper service. They learn from scratch. They then perform on Friday, and the following week take up a complete new program. So in about 3 years or so, they've gone through pretty much the entire Bach motet and cantata repertoire. And they won't forget it, I assure you. They never will forget it. I saw the performance. Not only are they well trained, but this particular discipline is very important. I've seen perhaps not as many rehearsals as some of you have seen, but I've seen a number. And I can tell you the density in the rehearsal, the density of direction was about as intense as I've ever seen. But the boys were responsive and trained and able to do it. During the 3-hour rehearsal, there was a break of about 15 minutes, in which these very serious, intent young boys and older boys, sitting in their chairs, cross-legged otherwise, but nonetheless singing and very intent in the most professional manner, suddenly turned into boys, fresh boys. And they raced out of the area into the yard, played soccer, then came back in as fresh as they had left, and sat down sedately, or as sedately as boys can do, in their chairs, and they concentrated totally on what they were doing. So it was total concentration and total training and a masterful direction. Now, the particular work, which was the featured work of the Friday program, which they were rehearsing this Thursday morning when we were in there, Thursday noontime, was Jesu meine Freude, which is one of the most difficult motets to perform adequately, not to perform it, but perform it adequately in the motet repertoire. It has challenges in there which are rather astonishing. The boys were learning it. The direction was intense. The management of the direction was intense. Nothing passed. Everything was corrected. Diction, approaches, everything was involved. The following evening, I missed the intervening rehearsal, which was done as the dress rehearsal in the morning on Friday. But we were at the evening rehearsal, and I tell you, it was one of the few times in recent years hearing a musical performance, the tears came spontaneously flowing out of my eyes. Couldn't hold them back. The performance was magnificent. Everything that they had been taught, that they had rehearsed, every correction came through in the performance. And better, of course, much better. The boys came in intent. There are about 80 of them. 2 groups, the young boys who were the pre-voice change and the young men who were the older after voice change. They came in with a canto behind, every one of them fully concentrated as a musical performer, prepared to perform. And that moment of total concentration is required before you've got the idea of your composition in your head, before you start to perform. They came marching in with that idea in their head, a full program. They performed with precision, with shaping of tone. They sang not on the notes, but they sang between the notes. They knew how to do that. They were trained for that. It's the most remarkable performance of Jesu meine Freude I've ever heard.
Now, those who 35 years ago, on March 18th, 1986, may have first heard of Lyndon LaRouche in connection with the victories of two of his associates in state primary elections in Illinois, and may think of him as primarily a presidential candidate from the year of 1976 election all the way through 2004, may be surprised to now learn that at the very same time of those Illinois primaries, LaRouche initiated a campaign to restore the proper tuning of voices and instruments to opera houses throughout the world. Why? Here he explains it with the help of two of his friends, the great tenor Carlo Bergonzi and baritone Piero Capocilli, two of the finest singers of the 20th century in opera.
We begin with Maestro Bergonzi, who is the honorary host today, as he has here his Verdi Academy of Busseto, and then Piero Capocilli, who just a few days ago celebrated the 40th year of his singing career. And finally, Lyndon LaRouche, the international guest who commissioned the American original of our book, Singing and Tuning, which we're presenting today. Well, Maestro Bergonzi, why is this question of the Verdi tuning pitch so important for voices singing Verdi?
As you know, we brought out the book in the United States originally, and I gave a demonstration of the two different tunings at Carnegie Hall. So I'm honored to present the book here today in the hometown of Giuseppe Verdi. But in the end, we've found that we really have not made a breakthrough. And this upsets me greatly, but I have to say it because we always need to tell the truth. We have Mr. LaRouche here today. He's very deeply committed to this question, which is so important to the young people, especially young singers, since they have to misplace all their technique by a half tone. And that's when they're lucky. Sometimes it's even worse. Now, we have not found a following among orchestral musicians, except for a few, especially among orchestral conductors, especially the symphonic orchestras. They just don't want to lower the tuning. What they want to do is to let the violins sing out. They want to let the brass sing out, but they don't realize that they can't regulate the human vocal cords. And this is the big point. The big problem is this. If we don't arrive at the lower tuning, or at least at a compromise between today's tuning and the Verdi tuning, then I have to tell you something which is really not very comforting. And that is that in a few years, we can just forget about hearing opera singers because all the voices will have been placed in the wrong way. We simply won't have the low voices. We won't have the high voices because when it's half a tone too high, it destroys the entire vocal technique. I don't want to seem to be a bird of ill omen, and I want the Schiller Institute to go battling forward, always move forward, always remain strong. I want LaRouche to persevere. I want him to keep going on this issue, and I will give all the help which is possible. But in the end, I'm afraid that we really have not had a very big success. So thank you.
We hope so too. And the most difficult battles are the ones we like to fight. Now I'll ask Maestro Capocilli, who's been with us in this campaign for the Verdi tuning ever since the first international conference at the Casa Verdi in 1988, where he sang musical examples in both tunings, high and low. This began a tradition which will be followed today here in the Sala Barezzi by Antonella Banaudi. Maestro Cappuccilli, from your 40 years experience as a singer, what's the importance of the Verdi tuning for preserving opera, especially for Verdi?
Beh, è facile dirlo.
It's easy to say why. The Verdi tuning is the right one. Human voices are made for the Verdi tuning, in the sense that when the pitch is increased, the voices get tired, and in long rolls they can't stand the strain. That's the fact. But the orchestral directors are only concerned with the orchestra, because they want the violins to sound off with a certain tonality. Loud, because they must ring out, the brass must ring out. But the voices are not brass. Nature made them natural. They are not brass. And now, what should we do? We should try to make really sure, to try with Mr. LaRouche, that we insist to fight for the Verdi tuning, at least for all the new voices coming up, to be able to sing, to be able to do it right, without forcing anything.
Now I'll ask Mr. LaRouche a question, and I'll translate into English also.
Attraverso questo libro e attraverso questa campagna internazionale dello Schiller Institute, cambiare la sensibilità del pubblico.
She'll translate this
in modo che questo
herself,
problema venga
and the answer
risolto.
will be in
How can
English.
the Schiller Institute and you, with this international campaign, change the attitude of the music world on this question of tuning?
Well, it goes to a deeper question that in my position, my specialty is a branch of science called physical economy.
È una questione più profonda. La mia specialità è una branca della scienza che si chiama economia fisica.
That I recognize that, as few have recognized, that the development of music in Europe, Bach, and especially after Bach, Mozart, through Verdi and Brahms, this school of music, plays an essential part in the very functioning of a culture.
E come nella mia esperienza anche come economista mi sono accorto che la cultura europea, in particolare la cultura musicale da Bach fino a Brahms, Verdi incluso, ha un ruolo fondamentale per lo sviluppo proprio della creatività.
There's a certain relationship to the creative powers of mind with this music, which does not exist in any other form.
E questo tipo di musica stimola la creatività umana più di qualunque altra forma d'arte.
We're in the danger of losing not only the music, but civilization right now.
Quindi stiamo rischiando non solo di perdere questa cultura musicale, ma anche la civiltà stessa.
Therefore, I thought it urgent to try to preserve the distillation of those principles of music which are essential to our culture.
Ecco perché per me è così urgente mettere per scritto, in un certo senso, i principi che hanno ispirato questa cultura musicale.
And to look at these principles known to musicians from the standpoint of science.
E a guardare a questi principi che sono noti ai musicisti dal punto di vista della scienza.
So that we can educate a new generation of teachers.
E lo scopo è quello di educare una nuova generazione di insegnanti.
Voglio dire ancora una cosa. E il fatto non è che
Let me add, in fact, it's not only the voices that are at stake. If you have a good voice, but with high tuning, even the heart is at stake. It makes for enormous fatigue when singing. Right? It's not just bad for the heart, it's bad for the whole body. Now we have to go back to singing normally, as Verdi had in mind.
LaRouche was seeking a way for Americans and for all people to find their voices and to properly place their voices once again. As we said at the beginning, a public discourse in a republic has to find the right pitch. All of the citizens must be called upon to deliberate as one sovereign republic, the idea that Lincoln successfully finally achieved through his 4-year presidency. And as not only a physical economist, but a statesman, presidential candidate LaRouche realized that if a nation has lost its voice, the greatest ideas cannot resonate in the hearts and minds of the people. For a nation to respond to a great crisis, a great task, a great moment, the people must hear that challenge as a voice from within them. And in the midst of crisis, of destruction and death, the tragedy of the moment must be enveloped in the promise of a far greater future that must be experienced as in harmony with what resonates from within them. lifting citizens from a condition of self-imposed tragedy to a sublime recognition of our available immortality is the task of both the poet and the statesman. It is the task that best qualifies an American presidency and its citizenry, and as with the spiritual, is our unique contribution to the world's classical culture, should we choose to make that so.
87 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead, we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.